This video is going to be about late neoclassical economics. If you are new to this is not really the place to start, because late neoclassical economics is like a specific type of neoclassical economics. So first, I'll put a link to what neoclassical economics is more generally. What is late neoclassical economics? There's a collection of new schools of economic thought which are quite similar to neoclassical economics. They drop one or two of the main assumptions, but they keep a lot of the rest of the framework intact. We could say that information economics is quite like this, behavioral economics is sort of in this category, new institutional economics, game theory, and there's one or two more. Why is it important to understand what these are and how they relate to neoclassical economics? The one important thing is that these are kind of the new mainstream, and they've replaced the role that old neoclassical economics had in dominating the discipline. And a lot of the time, people who are criticizing economics from the outside, or whether they're new students or activists, don't always pick up on this, and consequently a lot of their critiques kind of miss the point sometimes. They don't see that there's maybe less zealously pro-market parts of neoclassical economics, but also when they do come across one of these less zealously pro-market parts, they may mistake how revolutionary it actually is, whereas in fact it's a very minor critique which only justifies a very small amount of regulation rather than a more radical program. So that's the main issue. And this is it's the way neoclassical economic pedagogy is set up in most textbooks anyway. So mostly you're just going to be studying like a very small part of neoclassical economics and learning the foundations of the mathematical apparatus you're going to be building on later, but you don't see how it fits into a bigger picture. Particularly, you don't see how it fits into a bigger picture from a more critical point of view. So that's what I'm going to try and get to in this series. I'm basing this on a doctoral research of Yahya M. Madra. He's a student of Richard Wolff's. And what I really like about this thesis is it kind of links everything thematically in quite an interesting way. So some of the other critiques of neoclassical economics I found feel a lot like this laundry list of various technical disproofs, which are often very mathy, and they're like, oh no, this thing's actually polynomial instead of being linear, and therefore the theory falls apart, which is great if that's what you're into, but can be difficult for someone to really grapple with if they're new to it all. So the issue is that it is a very philosophical paper, and I'm really not a philosopher. So there are some more technical philosophical aspects which I may miss the main point of. Hopefully I get enough. I think it's still a useful read for economists, particularly heterodox ones. So his main take is that neoclassical economics is centered around what he calls the problematic of theoretical humanism. Basically, how do we reconcile individual rationality with a harmonious social order? We can think of this as the problem of the invisible hand, right? How do we get individual people acting through their own self-interest to benefit society? And does the state occur naturally? The one thing about this is that the idea of it happening only through the markets is not quite it, because it can happen through a number of political institutions, provided they are reconcilable with individual rationality. The other thing is that it's not necessarily just about selfishness, although it kind of is. It's more about beginning with these very localized preferences, which are not political in the sense they don't really care about how society functions. They care about much more localized things, and we build up from that into a stable society. So just to maybe help clarify what it is, I'm going to give some examples of what it isn't, and hopefully the contrast will make it clearer. So, here we have pirates or bandits, okay? What do I mean by this? The idea is that pirates or bandits or robbers are rational individuals in this sense, but they're not working in a way which creates a harmonious society. They're not signing contracts or building states or legal institutions. So it is not really part of what neoclassical economics is interested in looking at. How rational individuals may not create an harmonious social order. The other issue is communism. So you know this, like, when people say communism doesn't work because of human nature. This is basically saying it doesn't fit into the problematic of theoretical humanism. Because it's this idea of this rational individual which it's not derived from in the same way. And therefore it's outside the scope of the kind of systems considered by neoclassical economics, as well as a number of other social academic disciplines. I think I forgot to say that earlier, that the problematic of theoretical humanism is not just within neoclassical economics. There's a bunch of other liberal academic disciplines which also kind of focus around different ways of framing and solving this problem. My grandfather's axe is still an axe. What do I mean by this? Okay, so you know the story of it was my grandfather's axe, my father replaced the shaft and I replaced the head. Is it the same axe? So there's all sorts of different ideas of what a rational individual is and what a harmonious social order is. A rational individual might be utility maximizing with perfect information. They may only follow heuristics. They conceive of as rational in very different ways. Same thing with a harmonious society. It might be general equilibrium of a perfect market, but it also could be rational government or an evolutionary stable system. So I'll leave you to decide whether these actually all constitute the same thing, considering these parts are radically different. I don't think it really matters for the analysis, because what's interesting is the history of how the different parts are slotted in and out of the same overall architecture, rather than whether or not you end up with the same thing at the beginning or end. General equilibrium. This is basically... Now we're getting onto the history of neoclassical economics and the particular way it frames the question of theoretical humanism over time. And the presence or absence of general equilibrium is basically the most defining event and what shapes it. So what is general equilibrium? It's this idea that lots of markets can reach equilibrium at the same time. So if you think about first year economics, you learn about like supply and demand in one market, or maybe two markets linked together with elasticities and cross elasticities. But this doesn't really work. And particularly the heterodox economists who pointed this out a lot is Schaffer. And he said markets interact with each other in very complex ways, and this partial market analysis is really not useful. So the solution to this in neoclassical economics is to move towards models which incorporate lots and lots of markets simultaneously, and to show that they all balance out at the same time. So the first neoclassical economist who really tried to model this was Madra. The issue with his model is that it required an auctioneer to make sure that all prices were arrived at before any trading happened. Now, one thing is that this is clearly quite a silly idea. This is not how markets work. But the more important issue is that it kind of implies the need for some centralized authority. And this is what really made neoclassical economists uncomfortable with it. Much more than the fact that it couldn't be found in reality. Maybe that's a harsh take. So then it was next picked up by Aaron de Bro, who did actually show that you could find this general equilibrium without any central planning or authority, but they required very, very restrictive assumptions, which was and the idea is that these were so restrictive that it basically never happened. So it was shown to be slightly more robust than it was initially thought, but it basically collapsed as being the center of neoclassical economics. So what happened after this? So there's three different stories. The mainstream story is that they dealt with it. They realized the error of their ways, and they corrected for this. None of the new schools of thought are really based on it, and heterodox economists who are still critiquing it are basically chasing after something which no longer exists. Heterodox economists tend to argue that it basically is still the center of neoclassical economics, and most importantly, it's the center of their policy prescriptions for globalization and neoliberal economics. What Madra says is that basically it did substantially change the nature of neoclassical economics. There's no arguing with the fact that neoclassical economics radically shifted. But the shift didn't really fully get to grips with the issues that heterodox economists had been pointing out with general equilibrium theory. What he also says is that general equilibrium theory was always only part of neoclassical economics. So its collapse didn't really destroy the whole of neoclassical economics. The other important thing he says is that this big diversity or pluralism within neoclassical economics and within late neoclassical economics is actually part of how it controls the discipline. It's part of hegemony, that you don't just have one party line, you have plurality, but the plurality does still very, very much exclude certain heterodox schools, which are important for framing more radical critiques of neoliberal capitalism and providing more radical solutions. So that's where the series is going. We're now going to go over a much more detailed history of neoclassical economics, and hopefully that sounds interesting.